and then let people join. If people have, while they're waiting, if you don't already, you could follow our social media. And if you aren't a member of the Child Health and Wellbeing Network, please do register with us and share with wider colleagues to register. The links obviously are on the slides, but they will be shared as part of the presentation. Okay, we'll make a start, Carol. While we're waiting, please, if you could put your name in the chat, your job role and your organisation you work for, just give us a understanding of who we have in the audience today. My name is Laura Cassidy. I'm the Network Delivery Manager for the Child Health and Wellbeing Network, and I'll be taking you through a bit of an overview of the network and then handing over to the chair for this event, Adele Pearson, who will do the intros for the presenters today. Next slide, please. So to set the scene and give some context to everybody joining today, I guess this is probably no new news to people, some of our challenges that we face in our region. Children and young people account for around 20% of our population, and actually what we know is that a third of all children and babies and young people that are born in our region are living in poverty, and we've seen the steepest increase in child poverty over the last decade as a region, which obviously brings a lot of challenges when we're obviously trying to improve the health and well-being outcomes of children, young people and families in our region. We have the highest rates of A&E attendances for children aged 0 to 4 years, and actually it does lengthen and widen up to the age of 18 years. And a lot of the work that we're doing as a team and part of the work that I lead on around our Healthier Together website and mobile app is around trying to reduce those rates of attendances, because a lot of them actually could be avoidable. The North East has high rates of asthma admissions, and some of you may be aware of the work that we're doing as part of our Children and Young People's Transformation Programme around trying to improve the asthma admissions and asthma management through our asthma team of clinical advisors and our community asthma advisors. So lots of work happening at a system level. Recently there was the new stats were released for the National Childhood Measurement Programme, and unfortunately they don't paint a great picture for our region. We have 12% of reception children and 25% of our year 6 children are actually within that obese category, and within some of the highest rates in the country. Alongside that, we have a high proportion of our children eligible for free school meals, and that correlates for those not achieved a good level of school readiness by the age of 5. I think, and something that it's been a lot in the media recently as well, is the high rates of tooth extractions due to tooth decay. So a lot of outcomes that we're trying to improve and obviously address from a health inequalities perspective. Next slide. So from an ENC context and overcoming them challenges from a network perspective, a lot of the work that we do is very much about that collaborative cross-sector approaches, working with our voluntary sector, education and local authorities to ensure we reach into our most underserved communities. And Adele is our education advisor system as a part of our system leader team. So we're really trying to work with the broader system to ensure we're reaching the most underserved communities, and very much about being data driven and knowing where our priorities are in our areas that we need to maximise our resource. So it's very much how we can engage as a system and more broadly to really impact as meaningful as possible, and very much about upskilling the frontline workforce. And part of the asthma work has been focused on improving workforce knowledge around asthma management and care. Next slide. This just gives you the overview of the population for our children aged 0 to 17, and as you can see, it's broadly around that 20% range across our region. So we know, we've got around just under, I think it's under 600,000 children in our region, and actually that is, a huge population and geography that we have to cover with the work that we do. Going back to the child poverty, as I mentioned, a third of our children we know are living in poverty, and that exacerbates that ability as well to be able to improve health outcomes, but also for the challenges that those families face from a wider determinants and those more social determinants. To be able to improve their own health outcomes makes it much more challenging. Next slide. From a network perspective, on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see our priority wheel, which has a broad range of priorities, which I think will be, again, nothing new to use to yourselves on the meeting. We've got mental health, poverty, additional needs and vulnerability, inequalities and access, strong start in life, health promotion, childhood illness, and central we've got children, young people and families. And you can see in the dark blue there that actually as a result of COVID, we went back out to the system and to parents and families to understand what else, or if we were missing anything, and family support was what was added as a result of that. And I think from a lot of work that we do is and a lot of things that have been established since COVID, family support has been crucial as we've gone through cost of living rises and the challenges that families face in day-to-day life. We've very much got a shared vision, and it's very much that we believe all children and young people should be given the opportunity to flourish and reach their potential and advantage by organisations working together, and very much driven by that collaborative work and system work and ensuring that children and young people's voice is within that. What the system asked us to do was share good practice, drive work forward, and connect us in expert groups. And a lot of our network huddles are about that sharing of good practice and connecting expert groups together. Next slide. Our youth board, currently overseen by RISE, our young advisors, developed a youth board manifesto, and they very much brought principles and asks to professionals of what young people wanted from professionals and from health perspective. So you can see there the youth advisors are always involved in decisions affecting young people from the very beginning so that they can shape policies and practice. Young advisors have the opportunity to visit different types of young people with different needs and gather opinions for a wider range of young people, because actually what we know is that our young advisors and themselves know is that they're not always fully representative of all young people, so they reach out to the broader networks of young people's voice groups to ensure that young people's voices across the region are heard and inputted into the work that we're doing. They wanted more meetings with our adult board, so we've been doing board to board days, really trying to get to know the group and working more closely and part of their development, but also ensuring the professionals develop from the young people's perspective and understanding as well. And in meetings, what they want us to make and ensure is that we don't use jargon. And I think we can all be very guilty of that with no matter what system we work in. We all have different jargon relating health. I know we're very bad at acronyms, and I think even from an education perspective, Adele will agree, we all have our different terminology that not we all don't understand ourselves. So it's very much about trying to ensure that we are clear and speak in an understandable language. And you can see, finally, we'll finish off with a quote from Sir Alan Ainsley Green, who was part of establishing the actual Child Health and Wellbeing Network. The children matter, celebrate them and their contributions to society. Where there are injustices, shout from the rooftops to expose them. Where there is poor practice, kick the doors down to get change. Stand up together and be counted. Be effective advocates for the best interests. If you don't, who will? So I think again, it's about making sure that we ensure young people are at the centre of anything we're doing, because actually they're our future generation. And I'm going to hand over to Adele to chair today's huddle.
Morning, colleagues, and welcome. It's lovely to see so many of you on the call. I've just looked through the list of attendees, and I know some of you, but not all of you. I have the absolute privilege of being the system leader for education within the Child Health and Wellbeing Network. It's something I've been doing as part of my additional to my day job, if you like. So in my day role, I am a Director of Academy Improvement and head within a specialist multi-academy trust in the North East. So I have the privilege of meeting with young people every single day and hearing their voice. So when we were talking about what huddles were coming up and who was going to chair them, I heard that we were going to be doing this one around child rights, and my hand was straight up in the air because I think this is such an important topic that we need to talk about. So really lovely to have you all here. I appreciate everyone's really busy, so to take time out of your day to attend this such an important area is fantastic. So welcome everyone. Please do post on socials as we go through the morning. There will be opportunity later on in the morning to ask questions, or if you want to put questions in the chat as we go along, we will be monitoring the chat as we go along. But without further ado, in terms of the agenda, sorry, for this morning, I think everyone's probably seen that. So we're going to hear from Dr. Bronya Arnott, and then we're going to hear from our Katab. We're going to have a short comfort break in the middle to grab a coffee, go to the loo, whatever you need to do. And then the second half of the session will really be around Q&A, discussing with our panel members, and then wrapping it up at the end, thinking about how we take some of the fantastic learning from this morning forward into our networks. And I think that's one of the great strengths of the Child Health and Wellbeing Network, that we are cross-sector. So I know there's colleagues from VCSO sector on the call today, colleagues from health, colleagues from social care. So absolutely fantastic that we have this collaborative network within the North East and North Cumbria for us to work collectively for our young people across North East and North Cumbria. So without further ado, it's my privilege to introduce Bronya Arnott. So Dr. Bronya Arnott blends research, evidence, practice insights and public involvement to improve health and wellbeing from infancy. She's passionate about improving outcomes for babies, children and young people and reducing inequalities. And as we've just heard, and we all feel that on a day-to-day basis, you know, the inequalities in the North East and North Cumbria in comparison to other places in the country are stark. So we've got a big job to do here in the North East and North Cumbria. So Dr. Arnott proposes that children of all ages have the right and ability to express their views on matters that affect them. And we have a duty to ensure those views are acted upon. And I'm sure you're all here on this call today because you're all advocates for hearing those views of young people, children and babies. So Bronya is based at Newcastle University and holds roles across the NIHR infrastructure, with a primary role as a public and patient involvement and engagement methodologist with the Research Support Service. So fantastic welcome to Bronya. We really look forward to hearing all of what you've got to say. Please do, as I say, pop things in the chat and I'll hand over to Bronya. Can we have the next slide, please?
Thanks so much, Adele, for that warm welcome. Hopefully you can all hear me. And thanks, Adele, for getting my very long job title correct. It's one of the hardest things about the role, the length of the job title. So I'm delighted to be here talking to you all today. I'm going to be talking about children's rights and putting them into action. And I'm going to be relating it to research because I'm a researcher by background. And I'm very passionate about getting children and young people engaged in research and involving them in research. But as a lot's been said this morning already, that the huddles are always about working together across the system for making things better for children and young people and babies. And I really enjoy these huddles because they're a chance to learn from one another as well. So while I am going to talk about this in relation to research today, I'm really interested to hear from you after the break about how you are already applying children's rights in your work, or you might see a new opportunity to involve children's rights in your work going forward. So on the next slide, Every day we know that policymakers, practitioners, researchers and parents make decisions about the lives of babies, children and young people. Things that always make sense from their point of view, but how often do we think about how things might look to babies, children or young people? How often do we ask them for their views on the decisions that we make? And how often do we actually listen to them and then put what they say into practice? So on the next slide, you can see that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was developed and is now an important legally binding agreement that has been signed up to by 196 countries by July 2022. There may have been more since then. This is an agreement which outlines the fundamental rights of every child, and that's regardless of their religion, their race, or their abilities. And the 54 articles of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child cover all aspects of a child's life. And it sets out their social, civil, political, cultural rights. And it's universal. These are rights that apply to every single child, no matter what their background. But it also not only gives children their rights, but it puts the onus on us as adults to ensure that we work together to make it possible for all children to enjoy their rights. And there are 4 key principles underpinning all of the articles. These are the principles that help us to interpret all of the other articles and play a fundamental role in realising the rights for children. So these articles are Article number 2, which is about non-discrimination. The Convention on the Rights of the Child applies to every single child, as I've said, regardless of their religion, their language, their sex, whatever they think or say, whatever their background is, it's for everybody. Article 3 is about the best interests of the child. So the heart of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is that the best interests of the child must be a top priority in all decision making and action that affect children. Article 6 is about life, survival and development, and this means that we as adults and decision makers must do all that we can to ensure that children not only survive but thrive, and that's what this network is about. It's about children's flourishing. And finally, Article 12, respect for children's views, is what we're going to be focusing on today. So on the next slide, in more detail, we talk about Article 12 that states that children of all ages can express their views on matters that affect them, and that we as adults have a duty to ensure that those views are acted upon. And there can be a tendency to focus on the former, which is about giving children the opportunity to be heard, but there's a risk of missing out that second part, which is really important, that the views that are expressed must be given due weight in decision making. And I'd just like to focus on the fact that this applies to children of all ages. And it can be really challenging for us as adults to think about how this might work for very young children. And I'm grateful for Awa today, who's going to be really focusing on that sort of early childhood phase to give you some ideas about how we can do this for particularly young children. So on the next slide, you can see the Lundy model, which has been developed by Professor Laura Lundy at Queen's University Belfast. It was developed back in 2007, but it's still really helpful now because it helps us to understand the conditions that need to be present if we're to deliver on that Article 12. So the model sets out 4 criteria that must be fulfilled. And I'm going to go through those 4 criteria in a moment. But I will say that the Lundy model and the concepts are all interrelated, and each of the 4 elements needs to be considered, and ideally in a specific order. And if any one of the elements is missed out, it can undermine the process itself and therefore the fundamental outcome. And the Lundy model is great, I think, because it not only helps us to identify the strengths and weaknesses of what we're doing currently, but it also helps us to understand how we might improve. So the next slide helps us to understand a bit more about the Lundy model in practice. The 4 aspects of the Lundy model are space, voice, audience, and influence. The first 2 aspects, space and voice, relate to the right of a child to express their views. And the second two aspects relate to those really important things that we mustn't forget about their right to have their views given due weight. And those aspects are audience and influence. So space means that children and young people need to be given safe, inclusive opportunities to form and express their views. And this is the starting point, that if children don't have those safe spaces, you can't support them to express their views or to give them due weight. And so this is a fundamental stepping stone to the rest of the model. So what we can do is we can ask ourselves, how can we ensure that all children and young people feel safe to express their views on things? Building on this, the voice aspect means that children and young people can be supported to express their views. So we can ask ourselves, how can we identify what would help children and young people express their views? Could we provide them with different ways of offering their views? For example, many children may be able to express themselves verbally, but what about those who need to express themselves non-verbally? How could we incorporate that into understanding children? Once children and young people are able to express their views and they've been facilitated to express them, we need to think about how we act on those views. Audience means that the views of children and young people must be listened to. And I think one of the key questions here is, how can we demonstrate to children and young people that we have listened to them? And what can we do to ensure that they know that they are being heard? And finally, influence means that the views of children and young people must be acted upon as appropriate. And we must ask ourselves, how can we include those views in decision making, but also how can we show children and young people the differences that they have made? And on the next slide, you might think that I have been talking quite a lot about children and young people, but what about the rights of babies? And that is a really good question. This time last year, I did a huddle on the rights of babies and on listening to very, very young children. And it's available on YouTube. And if you want to go back and watch it, the opportunity is there to do so. But I just think it's key to remember that children of all ages do have the right to have their views heard and considered, but that for babies and very young children, we might need to work harder as adults to uphold their rights. So on the next slide, I wanted to move on to putting children's rights into action and how we might do this through their meaningful involvement, engagement and participation in research. Thank you for moving the slides on. I wanted to start with some definitions on these terms that we use in research and acknowledge that they don't necessarily map onto the way that some people might use them in different contexts. And I do think that's sometimes a challenge with working across the sector, but also an opportunity to develop a shared language. So these are the definitions used by the National Institute for Health and Care Research, the NIHR, who is a major funder of research in England. And involvement is defined as research that's carried out by and with children and young people, rather than being done to them or done about them or done for them. And so if I say that I'm going to involve children and young people in research, what I mean is that I'm going to build an active partnership with them in the way that we can hear their views, listen to them, but also have their views influence and shape the research. Engagement is defined as information and knowledge about the research being provided to babies, children and young people. That might be through activities such as theatre performances or science festivals. And participation is defined as babies, children and young people taking part in research. So they might be a participant in a study to help us to answer our research questions. We might collect data on them. That might include filling in a questionnaire, or it might involve having a blood sample taken. And so on the next slide, I think there are ways that we can focus on involving children and young people in our research projects across the whole cycle of the research. So this is what we would call our research cycle. And children and young people can be involved by telling us what they think we should do research on, what's important to them. They can help us to design research so it's inclusive and accessible. They can help us to make sense of the data that we collect and help us to share findings from our study. And hopefully in Arwa's talk next, you can hear about how very young children have been involved in various different ways across her project. Just moving on to slide the next one, thank you. If you are planning on doing research, myself and colleagues are able to offer you advice on involving members of the public of all ages, including babies, children and young people, through the Research Support Service and the Specialist Centre for Public Health, both delivered by Newcastle University and partners, so please do get in touch. And finally, just moving on the last slide, I just want to say I really look forward to hearing your thoughts later on how you might put children's rights into practice in your own work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bronya. And I love that last slide. Doesn't that just typify the vibrancy of children's rights and hearing our voices of babies, children and young people? So thank you very much. Please do use the chat, folks. I've popped in some links to some of the things that Bronya has been talking about. So please have a look at those. We're going to move on now to Awa Katab. So Awa is a PhD student in children's wellbeing and a research assistant also at Newcastle University. So Awa has a background in psychology and is currently at the end of her PhD at Newcastle University. She's focused her PhD on children's health and wellbeing as they start formal education, working with children between 3 to 5 years of age to co-design her interview methods, followed by adopting these creative interview approaches to give young children the opportunity to share their school transition experiences. Awa has worked on implementing public and patient involvement sessions with young children and parents throughout her project and hopes to share her reflections from all of these, the project and the interviews today. And I think just to say at this point, I'm really excited that we've got so many colleagues in the North East, and isn't it a privilege to have colleagues at Newcastle University championing this area of work? So absolutely fantastic, and a huge warm welcome to Awa. Over to you, Awa. Thank you.
Thank you, Adele, for that warm welcome. I'm very excited to be here and to connect with you all. So as Adele mentioned, I'm going to be talking about my PhD, my experiences doing my research with young children, and most importantly, the lessons that I'd learned. So if we go to the next slide, we can see how I'm going to lay out this talk for today. So I've got two parts that I'll be focusing on. The first part, I'm going to reflect on the current state of children's health and wellbeing today in the UK. And then I'm going to talk about my experience of working with young children as co-creators. So how I kind of involve them in my research and what I'd learned from involving young children. I'm then going to talk about my actual study outcomes. So these are the interviews that I did with young children to learn about their experiences of starting formal education. So in this context, it's starting reception at the ages of 4 to 5 years old. So I'll be focusing particularly on their experiences of using the bathroom and also their lunchtime experiences. So if you just go on to the next slide. So I want to start off by talking about some key issues in terms of children's health and well-being. So Laura went over some issues that we're currently facing in terms of children's health and well-being, and I'm just going to add a little bit onto that. So in terms of children's development, what we're noticing in recent years that a lot of young children between the ages of 2 to 5 years old are not reaching their expected level of development that we would expect to see at that age range. So for example, in terms of their communication skills, in terms of their fine motor skills, we're not seeing them at the level that we would expect to see. In terms of their physical health, we're also noticing quite a concern in terms of, for example, children's obesity rates. So for example, in recent years, we've found that 1 in 5 children who start reception are obese at the ages of 4 to 5 years old. And we know that particularly within the northeast of England, that's quite a prominent issue. And it could be related to the poverty levels that Laura had also spoken about, particularly within the northeast. So we've seen a very steep increase in terms of poverty rates within the northeast. And of course, that's going to have an impact in terms of the children's development, in terms of their physical health. And if we don't get involved in terms of remedying these issues from very early on, then we can expect to see that this is going to continue into adulthood. So in particular, in terms of obesity rates in childhood, we know that this can continue into adulthood, and children who are obese at a very young age are more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety. So again, causing further issues for young children. So it's really important to intervene in those early stages. And in terms of mental health problems, so this was the most recent finding that I could find for very young children between the ages of 2 to 4 years old. But we can see that approximately 1 in 18 children have symptoms of a mental illness. If we allow these issues to continue later down the line in later childhood and adulthood, then we're expected to see that this is going to cost us quite a lot. So in terms of current figures that we're seeing, it's about £16.13 billion spent on remedying mental health issues, development issues that occur early on in life that we sort of leave into later life. So it's really important to really intervene at the early stages. If we go on to the next slide. So despite the fact that I've mentioned these very important statistics in terms of children's health and well-being today in England, it very much motivates us to be able to, support young children from the early stages. But at the end of the day, it is children's rights to be able to live in environments that allow them to reach their full potential. So this is reaching their full physical, mental, spiritual, and moral potential. So it's not just focusing on those statistics to help us think that, young children deserve to be included in research, they deserve to have a voice to be able to share their opinions because of the poor health and well-being. It is their fundamental right to be able to live in environments that allow them to reach their full potential. So go on to the next slide. But the current issue that we have today is that a lot of young children are not included in research. So as Bronya mentioned, a lot of the research is essentially done on young children. So it's sort of like observations on children rather than actually getting them involved in research, hearing their voices and acting on what they've said. Part of the reason as to why a lot of young children are not included in research is based on this perception that young children are incompetent and unreliable. So it's the idea that if you have a conversation with a young child about your research study, for example, they won't be able to provide you anything that's meaningful, anything that will be able to help you achieve the outcomes that you want to achieve, to be able to support young children. There's also this perception that it's quite demanding to include young children in research. So for example, when you think about the time needed to include young children, it can take more time including young children in comparison if you were to interview an adult, for example. So in those cases, you would have to potentially speak to additional gatekeepers, who would have to speak to schools, for example, or parents, before you can actually speak to the child and include them in your research. You also have to think about developing specific activities to help build a rapport with the child. If you have a child who is quite shy, they might not want to fully express themselves in your interview or in your research study or any activities that you're doing with young children. You also need to think about particularly having activities that are engaging and fun for young children, for them to be able to understand what your research purpose is or the activity that you're doing, and for them to be able to express themselves in ways that are suited to their needs. You also have to manage the power imbalance between yourself and the child. So for children, they might have the perception that adults have all the answers to everything. And for that reason, they might only give you the answers that they think you as the adult want to hear rather than their own voices. And then also you have to advocate for the child whenever you're working with them, making sure that they feel comfortable and they're fully consenting to taking part in your research study or your activity. But at the end of the day, we are no longer in childhood as adults. We are only observers of children. They are the experts of their experiences. So essentially, in order to be able to best support them, we need to have conversations with children. We need to include them in our research. And as Bronya has mentioned, in terms of Article 12, every child has the right to express their views, their feelings, and their wishes in situations that affect them, so their day-to-day lives, and they have to have their views considered seriously and taken seriously. So we'll just go to the next slide. So I want to give a bit of context around my research topic, and I want to reflect a little bit about my experience of working with young children, particularly the lessons that I learned when I was designing my research study. So just to provide a bit of context, I focused on children starting reception. So as you can imagine, starting school can be quite challenging for a young child. They have to navigate making friends, they have to learn how to develop a relationship with the teacher, they have to remember the school rules, routines, and they have to put them into practice. So it can be quite challenging for a child to go into that environment. We know that with young children, if they do not have a smooth transition into school, that can have an impact in terms of their future perception or attitudes towards education. So if a child struggles at the start of school, they are more likely to drop out of education later on in life. They are more likely to have a criminal record later on in life if they have a poor early school transition. So again, it's really important to ensure that they have a smooth transition and to work with them at the very early stages of education. So for me, when I was designing my research study, I didn't know too much about the school transition, so I was quite interested in talking with parents and children just to learn a little bit about their experiences, to understand what the school transition is like. But for me, I had the perception that children will not be able to provide anything meaningful for my research study. That was the first perception that I had when I was working with young children. But that obviously later changed, so I'll go into a bit more detail. So on this slide, we can see that this was my first session designing a PPI study with young children. So the intention here was to provide photos of the school environment that the child was in. So this was personal pictures that the child had, and I would ask them questions about their experience, and I use these pictures as sort of like memory prompts for the young children to be able to remember their experiences and talk to me about it. I noticed that when I'd first engaged in this activity, although the children could remember their experiences, it was very much limited conversation. So they would only answer in short sentences or one-word answers, and it very much felt like a Q&A session rather than an actual conversation with the child. So it was me asking a question and they would answer with very limited responses. And I thought this isn't working out, but I'd initially thought that because I'm including pictures, it appears to be child friendly. It seems like it's suited towards the child. It's helping them remember their experiences. I'm doing something that's essentially meeting their needs. But at the end of the day, it didn't seem like it was quite sort of working with the children. So I had to change my method, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in the next slides. But I'd noticed very early on, I had this perception that although I understood Article 12 in terms of children's rights, where they have to express their opinions and have their opinions taken seriously, I noticed I still wasn't really adopting that mentality. The idea that I had in my head at that time was that children's opinions would only really be valid when they're adults reflecting on their experiences, because again, I had the perception that children cannot provide a lot of meaningful information, and obviously that's changed. So if we just go on to the next slide. So what I ended up doing in my future PPI sessions with young children was following the Lundy model. So Bronnie has very nicely explained what the Lundy model entails. But essentially, I was making sure that my PPI sessions and also my interviews later on, when I was collecting my data, was a safe space for young children to be able to share their opinions, for them to actually have the tools needed to be able to voice their opinions. And at this stage, I'm focusing on audience and influence. So this is hopefully, by the end of this presentation, we will be able to hopefully I will have changed your perception in terms of including young children in research, but also focusing on some of the outcomes of my study that will stimulate any changes needed within the school environment. So if we go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to focus firstly on voice. So for this activity, or for the future activities that I did within my PPI sessions, I included pictures and drawings. So with the pictures, what I did was I had different situations that can happen in school, and these were challenging situations. So they would see an image of, for example, a parent dropping off a child at school, or they would see a child walking to the bathroom by themselves. And it was the child's job to interpret the picture, ascribe meaning to the picture, and then be able to talk about how the child is feeling in those images and hopefully reflect on their own experiences. The drawing activities also involved drawing their experiences and talking to me about sort of what they drew and what their perceptions were of school. So the reason why I included those specific activities was because it's a familiar activity for young children. This is how they relate to the world, particularly through pictures. It also reduces the pressure on young children. So, for example, if I have a focus in my interview or when I'm doing an activity with a young child, and in this case it was pictures, they don't have to have that pressure in terms of maintaining eye contact with me, the researcher, so they can focus on the pictures itself rather than focusing on me. And it can be quite empowering for young children, particularly if, for example, they're drawing their images and they're explaining what they've drew. In those situations, they are the experts of the situation. They've drew their experiences and they're teaching me about their experiences through their drawing, so it can be quite empowering. In terms of how children responded to these activities, it was quite positive. So I had one child who, for example, English wasn't their first language. So what they decided to do was, once they'd viewed the pictures and were interpreting the images, to help them explain their experiences or the emotions that the characters were feeling, they drew the different faces associated with different emotions. So for them, despite the fact that they weren't verbally explaining it, they still had a voice to be able to explain their experiences in a way that was suited to them. So essentially allowing the child to decide how they want to interact with the images, if they want to draw their responses, talk about the responses, or do both, was really suitable in this situation to truly honour their right to give them the voice. But I did think about whether or not all children like to draw. So if we go on to the next slide. So I have a very quick question. Before the video plays, I just want you to think about what the first thing is drawn here. I promise it's a very easy question. It's not a trick answer. So if I could just have the video played. So it's supposed to be a stick figure. And I would hope that if I was to ask this question, everybody would say the head was drawn first. And I would also hope that you would agree that this is how you would draw a stick figure. If you just click on the screen here, just to show the next image. Yes, thank you. So when I was doing this activity with the child, the context around this was to ask the child to draw themselves in school. And this, when they were drawing the self-portrait, it stuck out to me. So instead of starting with the head, they started with the legs, and then they did the body, and then they did the arms, and the final thing that they did was the head. So it was quite interesting to see them engage in this activity, and I thought to myself, did they really enjoy this activity? Did they know what they had to do? So I had a conversation with the parent afterwards, and I'd asked them their opinions, and they said that their child wasn't really used to drawing any self-portraits. They've not engaged in this activity before. So it got me thinking about the fact that something might appear child-friendly, but is it truly child-friendly? Do all children enjoy drawing? Do all children enjoy this activity? So it was a motivation for me to include more than just one method, not just including pictures and drawings, but something else as well. So we go on to the next slide, please. So that's where I included puppets in my interviews. And the purpose of the puppets was to also give children a voice, but also to create a safe environment. So the context here was that this puppet, Mochi, has never been to school before, and the children would answer Mochi's questions around school rather than answering my questions as the adult researcher. So for them, from their perspective, they would think that Mochi truly doesn't understand anything about school. They're not an adult, they're not a human, so they are the experts in that situation. So the way that I introduced Mochi was I essentially tried to make some similarities between the child and the puppet. So I'd say Mochi is 4 years old, similar age to the child. I would say that Mochi's fur is really messy. Can you, the child, help Mochi to sort of brush out their fur? And then I would ask the child, you know, Mochi likes to eat anything orange. What can we think about that's orange that the puppet would like to eat? So that was a fun little activity for the children to be able to build that rapport with the puppet. In terms of the responses that I had to the puppet, it was quite positive. So in terms of the first response here, the supportive friend. So this for me confirmed the fact that the children truly had a voice in the interview settings. So for me, I'm asking the question to the child, is there any difference between reception in year one? So this was an interview that was done at the end of reception year as the child was preparing for year one. And the child said, yes, you know, there is a difference because there's homework, but in early years you don't have any homework. And then she stopped for a minute and she thought about Mochi and she said, Mochi, are you wondering what homework is? So for her, from my perspective, I see it as if I was interviewing this child, she might not have thought about this. She might not have wanted to explain what homework is because she thinks I'm an adult and I know what homework is already. I have the context. But she thought that for Mochi, he doesn't have that context. And so she explained that to them. So for me, it confirms that whatever the answers she's providing, it's truly from her own perceptions and it's her opinion, rather than providing answers that she thinks me as the adult wants to hear. So that was one positive aspect of having the puppets. The other positive was negotiating participation. So this was the safe space that the puppet provided. So as I was interviewing one of the children, I noticed that they no longer wanted to engage in the interview questions. They didn't want to take part anymore. But for a young child, it can be quite intimidating to say, actually, I don't want to take part. I don't want to do this activity. And so what we ended up doing, and this was based on this is what the child wanted, and I had just followed their lead. But we ended up just playing for the puppet for the rest of the hour. So for them, it was their way to subtly say that they no longer wanted to participate without the burden of actually having to verbally express it. So again, demonstrating that safe environment to be able to take part in research, but also decline participation if the child changed their mind. So next slide, please. So the final methods that I'd included was doing a drawing activity as the rapport. So this was to help the child be able to familiarise themselves with the research topic, which was the school transition. I was very cautious not to include this as the main data collection process because I knew that some children might enjoy the drawing activities, some children might view their drawing skills as be very critical towards their skills. In terms of the actual data collection process, I'd involved the puppet and I'd had the pictures for the children to view, and they decided if they wanted to add drawings or just explain the images itself. So next slide, please. So before I go on to explaining a bit of my study outcomes, I wanted to provide a quick reflection of the sort of design process of my study. And these are some of the lessons that I'd learned from myself. So the first thing was not to jump to conclusions. Just because something appears child-friendly, it doesn't guarantee that all the children will enjoy this activity and fully be able to have their voice and explain their experiences with that activity. I'd also learned that it was really important to include more than one method, again, to allow each child to have at least one avenue to be able to explain their experiences, to express themselves in the way that is suited for them, and also to be flexible and follow the child's lead, and to have trust that young children can be reflective, they can provide meaningful information, but you just have to allow the child to have some control over the session to be able to provide that safe space from them potentially allow them to sort of express themselves better with that flexibility. And I've included this small quote, "Nothing for me without me," because at the end of the day, young children are the experts on their lives, and we should include them in conversations if we want to better their lives. So we just go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so at this section, I just want to talk about my study outcomes. So I'll provide a bit of context in terms of my study. So I had 10 families that took part in my interviews. The children were between the ages of 4 to 5 years old, and they were interviewed at 3 different time points within reception. So this was at the start of reception, approximately the middle of reception, and then at the end of reception as they were preparing for year 1. I had families from a lot of different backgrounds. So I had white British, Black British, South Asian, and British South Asian. I've also included the images that the children saw. So these were the images that I talked about previously. So they would see an image of a potentially challenging situation. They would interpret the images and they would then talk about how the characters were feeling. Next slide, please. So in the next couple of sections, hopefully I'll be focusing on influence and audience to be able to truly do something with what the children have told me is important in terms of their school experiences. And to be able to do so, it's starting to have those conversations with people who are interested in children's health and well-being to sort of stimulate any changes needed within the school environment. So I'm particularly focusing on the experience of going to the bathroom alone and their lunchtime experiences. So go on to the next slide, please. So in terms of the bathroom environment, so throughout all of the interviews that children had, a lot of negative emotions were associated with using the bathroom, particularly around the fear of being by themselves. So in the first image, you can see that the child had drew a stick figure. They drew other people with the character in the image. And for them, they explained that the character in this image feels quite sad. They feel scared that they're going to the bathroom alone, and they're drawing their parents. And they said to me that in order to feel happy going to the bathroom in school, they want their parents there with them. In the second image, it focuses on some of the fears that children had in terms of getting lost on their way to finding the bathroom. So these were in schools where the bathroom was outside of the classroom. So in this image, you can't really see it, but essentially what the child had done is drew lines to the bathroom and outside the bathroom, explaining that these lines would help navigate the child towards the bathroom and how to get back to the classroom. So a lot of children reflected on their experiences of getting lost. In the text, the red text below, we have a child who was from a South Asian background, and for them, just a bit of context, what they're used to using at home when it comes to using the bathroom is a bidet, so that involves water. And for them, they were saying that they avoid using the bathroom, avoid going to the toilet purely because they don't have what they're used to using at home, so using a bidet. So they said they don't have water. The water that's available is only used for washing their hands, and for that reason, they would wait until they're at home because they don't like using the bathroom. So it's a lot of physical discomfort that they might have if they're not using the bathroom when needed. And when we focus on Article 30, it explains the importance of allowing children to be able to live their lives in environments that allows them to practice their cultural beliefs, their personal beliefs, and all that sort of stuff associated with the family sort of belief system. But in this scenario, it seemed like that wasn't being sort of met for this particular child. We did have some positive responses, and that was associated with being independent. And some children talked about having a positive experience because they didn't have to wait in a long line. So again, not having that physical discomfort, waiting to use the bathroom. Go on to the next slide, please. But in terms of the bathroom experience within the wider context, if a lot of children are avoiding using the bathroom for a prolonged period of time, then that can have potential health implications. So particularly increase the rates of urinary tract infection in young children. We also know that when it comes to using the bathroom in reception, 25% of reception teachers last year stated that a lot of children were not toilet trained as they were going into school. So that meant that a lot of time was spent helping children use the bathroom rather than sort of time needed for teaching. In terms of children's development, so if children continue to avoid using the bathroom, could this potentially have an impact on other factors that's important to them? So, for example, being able to develop their independence, being able to sort of develop their motor skills. So, for example, flushing the toilet, dressing themselves independently as well. We also know that this is a common issue that is not just with the participants of my study. So there was a study in 2016 where young children also disliked using the bathroom because of the cleanliness, the smell, and essentially the design of the bathroom. So my question is, how can we help children? What can we do to take their responses seriously? How can we make change? So go on to the next slide, please. So should we involve children in, for example, designing their own bathroom? So when it comes to the reception environment, a lot of attention is usually given to, for example, how the classroom is set out, how the outdoor play area is set out. But is there a lot of attention given to, for example, the bathroom environment? The bathroom is still a very important environment for young children because at the end of the day, they will be using this quite regularly. So should we pay attention to how we design the bathroom experience, the layout for them, for example? So go on to the next slide, please. So in terms of the lunchtime experience, it's similar to the bathroom experiences in terms of the layout and whether or not it's actually comfortable enough for children to be able to fully engage in, for example, using the bathroom and sort of having their food. So in terms of this particular experience, I wanted to focus on this positive comment that one of the children shared during the interviews. So she talked about how the characters in the image that were lining up to have their lunch were feeling quite happy, and she then reflected on her own personal experiences, and she said that at lunchtime something happens to her where she feels like she's at home and she's eating and she's imagining the teachers are like family serving her food. So that was quite nice to hear. And to give a bit of context in terms of her lunchtime experience, she would have lunch within the classroom rather than going outside the classroom and into the lunch hall. So for this particular child, it could be that she's quite familiar with the classroom environment. She's got a lot of positive memories potentially associated to this environment. She's used to it. And what they also did in this school was they would have the teachers sitting with the children eating the food. So similar to potentially traditional sort of having dinner at home with your parents, sitting with the adults. She's also talking about the teacher, so potentially the positive relationship with the teachers is also having an impact in terms of her experience. So if we go on to the next slide. But this wasn't the same for everybody else. So for the rest of the children, the way that they had their lunch was they had to go to the lunch hall. So again, sort of having to familiarize themselves with a new environment. And there was a lot of sensory issues that came out of this. Some of the children complained about the loud noises during lunchtime and they disliked the loud noises. Some of the children had difficulties with the heavy trays, carrying it independently. One of the children described an experience where they dropped the food and all the food had went onto them and they were quite sad about that. And also within the lunchtime, the lunch hall experience, it could be that there's more monitoring of food intake. And with one of the children, she had explained potentially the anger associated with that. In terms of Article 29, it talks about how the education of a child should be directed in terms of the development of their personality, talents, mental and physical abilities to their fullest potential. But if we're neglecting the design of the lunchtime experience, the layout of the lunch hall, for example, or the layout of the bathroom sort of environment, does that mean that children are at a sort of discomfort? So for example, if a child is not going to the bathroom, they have the physical discomfort of needing to go to the bathroom. And for that reason, when they're sitting in the classroom, they're not actually listening to sort of what the teacher is saying. And for that reason, they're not receiving the education that they need to be able to reach their full potential. Go on to the next slide, please. So in terms of the changes that we need to do we need to reconsider where children have their lunch? Do we need to include children in terms of the conversations that we have around redesigning their lunch spaces? And is there anything else that's feasible for us to be able to make sure that these spaces are comfortable for children in terms of when they're having their lunch? So just go on to the final slide. So just to end with the sort of final messages from my PhD project, the main message that I want to give across is that despite the fact that children are different from adults, they are not deficient. They connect with the world differently, they communicate differently, but that doesn't mean that they are limited and deficient and therefore shouldn't be included in research. From my experience, including young children in research was really meaningful in terms of understanding their experiences that us as adults might not recognise. So, for example, we might not recognise that children struggle with the bathroom because we're not in those environments observing children. So, young children can and should be active participants. And we should include children's rights with everyday decisions. So, from the layout of the bathroom to the layout of the classroom as well. And from my personal perspective, I think that working with children is truly the way to honour their rights rather than doing research on them, so observing them or speaking with adults. So I just want to end with this question for you to think about. I hope that by the end of this talk, you've potentially changed your perspective if you originally thought that young children cannot be included in research as active participants. And if you have changed your opinion, what made you change your opinion? And if not, why not? So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions after the comfort break.
Thank you so much, Arwa. That's been absolutely fantastic to hear just that process of research, how you've had to change things midway and what you've learned from that. And I think there's so much that we can all learn, however we're working with children and young people. So we've got a comfort break now. It's 11:02 on my computer. I'm going to suggest we take that till 11:10. There's been lots of things going in the chat. Please do come back and have a think about what you want to ask our fantastic panel, and we will take it from there. So see you back here at 11:10, everyone. Thank you. Okay, welcome back everyone. I hope everyone's had the opportunity to top up on coffee and take a quick comfort break. Just going to check our two presenters are back in the room. I can see Bronya there. Howard, are you there as well?
I am, yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so we've got about half an hour now, folks. I know a couple of people have had to leave to go to other meetings. I can see we've still got 26 colleagues on the call. So we've got about half an hour to really discuss, I suppose, what our colleagues have shared with us, to ask any questions, to get any hints, tips, advice from them. I can see that some colleagues have popped some things they're doing in the chat. It'd be great for people to share. I can see Chris on the call. I know Chris does some absolutely fantastic work in this space. So for colleagues to share what they're doing in this space. And just wanted to draw your attention. So Dan from Rise has put in a message earlier in the chat about our Impact Youth Board. So we're currently looking to recruit a handful of new members. I'm really, really passionate that we ensure we have a good representation of children and young people from the region, but then also from different backgrounds and some neurodiverse young people. So if anyone's interested or know of any children and young people who may like to get involved in our youth board, then Dan's popped his email address in the chat. I also popped in the chat, as colleagues were speaking, some links to some of the things that they were talking about. So let's just go to the chat. Does anyone want to start us off with a question for our colleagues who've presented? Oh, Chris, fantastic.
I've been sat eagerly waiting for you to ask. Yeah, I've got a comment, I've got a plug, and I've got an ask, if that's okay. So
absolutely.
My comment was just starting with kind of Bronya's presentation. Bronya, I'm not sure whether you know which colleagues are involved from Newcastle University, but we're involved as a collaborative partner with the Northern Youth Research Partnership around how young people can be involved in leading on collaboratively on research, and we'll be able to share our findings from that piece of work towards the end of this financial year. So I'm not sure which of your colleagues is directly linked in with that, because I'm not directly linked in with that. It's a couple of my colleagues who are doing that. But if it's not something you are linked in with and you want access to that information in terms of the findings from that, I can pass your details on to my colleagues if that would be helpful. So that was my comment. My plug is, obviously this is about rights-based, and we are a Children and Young People's Rights organisation, and we have an award, the Invest in Children Membership Award, which evidences how services have meaningfully involved children and young people within dialogue and change. So if anybody wants any more information on that, please do get in touch. But it also links to my question, and that was for our it was a fantastic presentation, really, really interesting. And we're having numerous conversations with earlier settings around how they can apply for the Invest in Children Membership Award. And we have a number of earlier settings that have done some fantastic work to meaningfully involve children and young people within kind of early years foundation stage. And I loved your example around the puppet. I think that's something that we've used in the past in terms of creating either a puppet or a fictional character to kind of take that pressure away from children and young people, or for them to share their experiences through that conversation with the puppet. But I was just wondering, this is where my question comes in after my plug, is around, do you have any other case studies or examples in terms of how practitioners have overcome the kind of some of the barriers, the challenges to involving kind of younger children, kind of early as foundation stage children, in meaningful dialogue and change? And I just wondered if whether it's something you kind of have anything else as part of your research, or kind of some case studies that you're able to share with us. Because as I say, we've got some great examples from kind of nurseries, but I'm just thinking like health practitioners who say, oh, well, we really struggled, or we rely on the voice of the parent and the carer. So if there are any case studies or examples you can kind of share from younger children, we'd be really kind of keen to hear from yourself or Bronya, if there's anything you could share.
Yeah, I mean, from myself, in terms of my personal experience, so for me, this was the start of actually working with young children, so that's where my experience comes from. But in terms of, I know that there are a lot of articles in terms of including young children when it comes to conversations around health. So I think there was one around getting young children's perceptions of their opinions of breastfeeding. So I can send you some of those articles. I know some colleagues have also done some work with very young children in terms of oral health, so I can connect you with those. But I think Bronya also has a lot of experience with working with younger children, so I wonder if she's got any particular case studies that she can go into. I know she's done some work with babies as well in terms of getting their perceptions.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I did the sort of huddle last year on listening to babies' voices, and there are sort of steps being taken. I think in terms of sort of listening to babies, I think Blackpool Better Start have done a lot of sort of good work around that. And I think they're starting to sort of put information out there. I think Starcatchers have done some great work in Scotland as well. So maybe we can sort of share some of those links as well. And I just want to say I was one of the supervisors for our PhD, but we also had a sort of community paediatrician as part of the team. And I think they just acknowledged that there weren't a huge amount of sort of great case studies and that this was really important in the sort of learning for the sort of wider system, you know, sort of beyond research, just about sort of how we can do this and how we can do this well.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris, and thanks to Bronya as well for answering that question. Rachel, Colin, I can see you've got your hand up. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, yeah. So I'm the family engagement lead for the Northern Neonatal Network. So we support all 10 neonatal units across North Cumbria region. And I'm just, well, this was amazing. I love this. I was thinking about, so we do a lot of work with siblings of babies who are on the neonatal unit and trying to include them more. And like some of your methods would be absolutely fab, I think, for us getting a real understanding of what the neonatal unit is like for siblings. But I know, I can't remember which article, I want to say Article 3, but I might be getting that wrong. But I know one of the articles in the UN Convention talks about like babies should not be separated from their families unless it's in the safety of the baby. And obviously the neonatal unit massively violates that, because generally across the UK, parents can't stay overnight. Some units have very restricted visiting times, and I hate the word visit anyway. But so actually separation is like the normality on a neonatal unit because of the logistics. And I've brought this up a couple of times, and it's kind of like, oh yeah, that's in the UN Convention, but I think it feels so distant from on the ground. People maybe don't consider it or take it seriously or think it's something actually that they do have to do. So I just wondered if you'd come across that before, and if you've got kind of any tips on how to give the UN Convention a bit more weight in informing practice, I guess.
That's such a good point that you mentioned, Rachel, and thanks for sharing that. But for me, the best example that I can give is from myself. I'd explained that for me, when I was working with young children, I'd understood that it was the Article 12 about children's voices and taking their opinion seriously. I knew that existed, but I wasn't really taking that in. I wasn't really truly embodying that right for young children. But what truly worked for me was actually working with the young children and listening to them and seeing how meaningful it was. So I would feel like the best way to convince people to actually take on children's rights and not just be a tick box exercise saying that, yeah, we're going to do it, is to get them to listen to the family's experiences, to the children's experiences, and to reflect on themselves. Are they truly allowing children's rights to be met in that environment? Or is it just a case of we just say that we're doing it, or we're going to aim to do it, but there's nothing really put into practice? So the best answer that I can give is just self-reflection, and how do we be able to sort of, with your sort of healthcare environment, how can you get people to reflect on their own perceptions, and can they do more? For me, that was the best sort of way to be able to make change and to truly adopt children's rights.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Rachel, for asking that question. Do we have any other questions? I've got a few, but I'll hand fire and let colleagues ask any questions. Okay, so I was particularly thinking about your research. What do you think the kind of next steps are in this? It's such a key important area. We've already identified there's not a whole load of case studies out there that we can learn from. So what would you advise? We've got colleagues on the call from different sectors. So what can we be doing as a collective, and kind of what do you plan to do in terms of that next step?
I think the best thing to do next is to truly understand what the scale of the problem is. So as you've mentioned, there is very limited information about children's experiences when, for example, they're using the bathroom or their lunchtime experiences. So we need to understand to what scale is this a problem for young children. And from there, we can understand what other issues might crop up. Because for me, I'd only interviewed a handful of young children. So there could be a lot of other issues that we need to pay attention to. So I would say that is definitely the sort of next step in terms of figuring out what to focus on in terms of what the actual problems. I would also say that we do need to change how the bathroom is sort of set up for young children, make it into a more comfortable environment. For me, what pops into my head is when you think about children's hospitals, the environment that they have is very child friendly. They've got paintings on the walls. It's very sort of like welcoming. And I would think that we would potentially benefit from having that within the children's bathroom, particularly if they're afraid to go alone or they're sort of unsure of where to find the bathrooms, to sort of have better ways to allow children to be able to navigate in their environments. And I would also talk to teachers to see what's feasible for us to be able to change within the school environment. So I think at the beginning of this talk, there was mentions of some people from schools. So I'd be quite interested to see what they think as well, if they had any kind of input in terms of what the next steps should be. But from my perspective, it's definitely do a lot more research and a lot more conversations with children and with teachers and also with parents as well.
Thank you, that's great. Anyone else? Oh, Rachel, come on. You've got your hand back up.
I'm
Yeah,
hogging,
no, that's
hogging,
okay.
I'm hogging the mic.
Not at all. It's
I think I had you mentioned at the start of your talk that you said on a different project, or maybe one related to this, you had included the children in developing the questions and a questionnaire. I'd love to hear more about that, because I've tried doing that before and it did not work, and I clearly was not using the right method. So I would love to hear how you did that.
So it wasn't necessarily the questions for the interview, but more sort of focusing around the methods essentially. But I would be quite interested to know what was the methods that you used to be able to, I guess, figure out the questions to ask.
Yeah, so ours was more like, how you said at the start of yours that it felt a bit like a Q&A and you were getting very kind of short answers. It was a bit like that. So we'd kind of got a simplified version of the kinds of things we were going to ask people, and we just wanted their opinions. But I think we made it far too open. It's like you said, I think kids are so used to being told like the teacher is right, that when you say to them the research is not right, we don't know, we need you to help us, they're like, whoa, because that's so different from what they're used to. So I think, and I hadn't worked with children in a kind of co-production sense before, and then the money ran out for that. It was like a little tiny bit of funding we had, so it kind of stagnated. But I would love to pick it up again, because I just think it's so important to include the people that you're trying to do the research about in the research. So I just wondered if you had any secret tips on how
that's really interesting. That's really interesting, because for me, when I was working with the young children, I felt like the more structured the session was. So for example, with the images that I had, the first images that I'd used, where it was pictures of the child, and I was asking them very structured questions or pre-planned questions, I felt like that was one thing that made the session very restricted in terms of the conversation that I could have with the child. So I took more of a flexible approach where I'd introduce the child to the topic, and I had some pre-planned activities, but I also wanted to follow the lead of the child, but not completely to the point where they would say, talk about a completely different topic, just sort of have prompts that would lead them back to the main topic of discussion. But I personally felt like the more flexibility that I had, the more child-led it was. I was able to get the most meaningful answers. And I think also one thing that really helped was removing that mentality of I'm trying to find a certain answer from the children, and just to kind of see what the children say, because they're going to provide information that's meaningful to them that I might not have recognized, and I won't recognize until later on. And I noticed that when I was interviewing the children, they would say things, and in the interview, I'd think, oh, but is this going to help me with my PhD? Is this going to be helpful in terms of how can I work with this information that they're giving me? But it was only until I sort of reflected on the interviews and I was analysing my data that I was like, oh, actually, this is super helpful. And this is a perspective that I didn't even realise, because I had these preconceptions of the answers that I would be given. So the best advice that I would give is follow the children's lead, be flexible, but do have prompts to be able to keep them engaged and on the topic.
Thank you, so helpful.
No problem.
Thank you. I can see Rachel has got hand up. Rachel, can we bring you in there?
Yeah, apologies, I haven't got a camera. I'm hoping you can hear us. Yeah, I just kind of want to follow on from what I was saying, really. So I work in a special needs school. So obviously it's ranging from ages 2 to 19, and we've got a complete mix of different requirements, different needs. And we sort of operate the same kind of way as you are, where we're a rights respecting school. And so to call it an interview, I suppose, would be, it's not the preconception of an interview, is it? It's something completely different. So a lot of people would sort of say, oh, well, you're just having a chat or you're just having a play. But that is exactly how you will gather the information that you want. Like you say, with a few prompts here and there, a pre-planned play, it might be, but actually it's so using the term interview sounds completely different from what it actually will look like, because you're exactly the same, following that young person's lead. If they've got a specific interest, you're going to get so much more from that session with that young person, and actually unlock a lot of probably what they want to tell you without them knowing that they want to tell you it, I guess. And again, linking back to what you were saying, Bronya, about those young people who maybe are not non-speaking. Again, you're going to get lots from those kind of interactions with those young people that are much more about being in their presence rather than necessarily that interview word that you sort of might get hung up on. Yeah, sorry if that sounded a bit rambly, but I hope I've got my point across.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I think that's great. And I think that we're talking about such a wide range of age and, as Rachel's pointed out, of need as well. We've got a significant increase in babies, children, young people with neurodiversity. So really, really key that, like I talked about the COI group before, that we're able to capture that voice, whether that's a physical voice or not, from all of as many as possible of our children and young people in the North East and North Cumbria. Okay, thank you. All right, another question from me, and you kind of touched on, I think we've touched on some of this. Any advice around, because I think sometimes, and certainly from an education perspective, we had a conference a couple of weeks ago for our trust, and we talked about some professional inquiry and research. And I know a lot of colleagues in the classroom, as soon as you mention the word research, they go, whoa, that's big and scary, and that's what PhD people do, that's what people at university, and I'm a teaching assistant in a classroom, I don't do research. And actually what we talk to colleagues around is, we do research every single day. We're constantly researching, we're constantly using our professional curiosity in terms of looking at what works, what doesn't work. So any advice, either Bronya, or anyone else on the call, in terms of empowering colleagues in possibly education settings, in health settings, in social care, to carry out some research, and whether that be on a small scale or a large scale? What would your hints and tips be?
I'm happy to take this one first. I think research has been seen as that sort of ivory tower, and it's something that's done in universities. And then I think obviously there had been to very a sort of move towards hospitals doing it, and we learned that when hospitals were involved in research, patient care was much better. And I think there's now, very slowly, that recognition that this could be true of social care, it could be true of education. And there is bits of research, and I think there's opportunities to get involved. But I think there's now a movement towards people across the system doing research themselves. So, you know, I think there's more money coming for sort of social care research, primary care research. And I think just the NIHR, for example, does provide those opportunities for people to get involved. But I think people need support. So I did mention the research support service that Newcastle University offers, and you know there are opportunities to just come along, have a chat about things, and just start on that pathway. You know, and you're not going to go to doing randomized control trials on, you know, your first day or anything like that. You can start to just think about those little questions that you would like to answer and how you might do that and get support from people who have, you know, lots of expertise in various different things. So yeah, I think people are starting on that journey and we're happy to support them.
That's great. Thank you, Branya. And I'm sorry if I've missed a link in the chat. Is it possible to get a link for colleagues so that if they do want a link in, we can share that? Okay, great. Anyone else with any other questions? We've heard so much this morning about just how very important it is that we I think for me, one of the things I would reflect on being ahead in a specialist setting, and as I said at the start, having that privilege of working with our children and young people every day, it's not just the young people, children and young people having their voice. It's that listening and action, and they're the biggest ones who hold us to account. You know, we have a student counsellor within the school that I lead, and they produce minutes. They said, oh, we want this, and this is why we need this, and we've done the research, and kind of these are the costs, and they hold me as a head to account. And I love that they hold me as a head to account, because actually I think that's really powerful for them in terms of it. And sometimes, you know, there's big ticket items where we have to have a conversation around, actually this isn't possible, but can we look at this, and different things like that. And I think it's so powerful for young people, children and young people, to have their voices heard, not just to change that immediacy of whether that's a bathroom or a lunchtime or something like that, but to prepare them for their life as citizens in a democratic society, that they know that they've been heard in schools, so therefore they'll be heard in other places. So really, really equipping them with those skills and those social skills, those communication skills, to not only have their voice heard, but their voice listened to as well, and some action from that. Chris, I can see you've popped your hand up. Do you want to come in at that point? Oh, you took your hand down, but you're still muted.
Thank you. Yeah, it was when you were saying around young people holding adults to account, and I suppose your question around top tips for research. I suppose it's thinking about why are we doing it and what information are we already sitting on, because the last thing young people and families want is you asking their opinion when you may have already asked their opinion, and actually you haven't provided any feedback or information in terms of what you've done with that information in the first place. So it's ongoing dialogue and what's changed or what hasn't changed, and what are the reasons for that, what are the barriers, because actually your next piece of engagement might be around, well, it hasn't changed, what's the reason, and how can we work together to identify, compromise, overcome those challenges, as opposed to just kind of keep talking but nothing ever happens. So it's what's the purpose, why are you doing it, what do you want to achieve? But I suppose then talking about what I was on about in terms of that flexible approach, you might go in with your goals but actually be flexible and open, because actually what they come back with might be very different to what you expected. So I suppose it's answering that so what question.
Yeah, really, really key, Chris, isn't it? That's so what, and to keep that engagement as well. I think, as you said, you know yourself, if you fill in a survey or you're involved in something and nothing changes, you think, well, next time you ask, I'm not going to bother replying. And so really, really key. I can see Rachel's popped something in the chat around empowering rights in our school has also had an impact to homes and the community. Rachel, can I just bring you in again just to explain a little bit? So it's not just within the school community. I can see that it's doing work wider than that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we started on the rights respecting journey quite a long time ago, and it does take quite a long time to sort of get that all embedded. But because it's become so embedded in school, the young people are so used to having their voice and so used to hearing that vocabulary around rights that it automatically has spread. So they use those sort of similar words in communities that we visit and in spaces that we go to and at home, and it kind of just it became a lot bigger without us even trying to make it bigger, because it just became so embedded that the young people were so empowered by knowing about their rights that it just spread from them. So it wasn't that we gave them a voice, they just learned how to use their voices, I suppose. So once the conversations are started and the words are started and the vocabulary is started, it does automatically spread, because the young people want to talk about it. They absolutely do, and they understand, and they want to empower other young people, and they want to support people at home, and it does just automatically spread. So it just takes tiny little bits, but it does get bigger.
Well, thank you, Rachel. Lynn, I can see you put your hand up. Would you like to come in there?
Yeah, sorry, I haven't got my camera on. Yeah, I did put in the chat there. We're a mental health charity working with young people aged 4 to 25 and their parents and carers. And I just attended an ADHD parents group yesterday evening. I've been working with them for over 17 years. But one of the questions that always comes up and complaints is the difference between us as professionals sitting here and wanting children to be heard. That is everything that I live for every day. Listening to children, we are a youth-led project, and the complexities of young people on waiting lists for neurodivergent assessments, as an example. There are other things. But the problem we've got is, so a lot of statutory services won't work with these children whilst they're on a waiting list. However, then their mental health deteriorates. So us as professionals, who clearly are on this session because we care about young people, how do we overcome that? Because, for years I've been beating this drum, and I do understand, yes, the challenges of we maybe don't have enough people to actually carry out assessments, or the right people to carry out assessments. Funding is a massive issue, which I go to strategic meetings with commissioners, and I appreciate all of that. However, how can we, stand up for these children who are being left behind? And I've worked in youth justice as well. And unfortunately, this is 20 years ago, meeting young people who had more or less been written off at age 7, which absolutely broke my heart. And that was my impetus to set up this service, because these young people hadn't had an opportunity. They did feel different. They didn't fit into mainstream education. And, their life took on a totally different trajectory. So yeah, I'd be grateful for any help with this.
So what can we do, given that, am I right in just still in that, Lynn, that in terms of, we know we're working in very complex environments where resources are stretched, funding is stretched, but what can we do within our gift to support these children and young people? Bronya, Awa, and then I'll come back to myself because I've got some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, just in terms of that, I think that children's voices are only ever going to be part of the puzzle, but I think it's important that they are part of the puzzle. And, sometimes I think that they're not currently. So yes, there will always be things about, do we have enough staff to deliver things? Do we have enough funding? But currently, sometimes children's voices are not part of the decision making. And I think it's really important that we do start to prioritise this. And I do wonder if having a shared language would be important, using this terminology with people who are making decisions about children. This is a child rights issue. And that, you know, if they start to hear that from different parts of the sector, they might start recognizing this is not just about child voice, but this is actually child rights, and that this is something that they are accountable for and need to be accountable for. And I think it's also potentially about having advocates across the system, you know, child right advocates, people who have the skills and the mindset, you know, like yourself, Lynn, who can really, you know, children are not necessarily always in those rooms where the decisions are made. I think it's great with the COI that, you know, they do have those joint sort of board meetings that RISE facilitate, as sort of Dan mentioned earlier. But children aren't always in those settings, you know, and I think it is about advocates just maybe it's calling ourselves child rights advocates, you know, something like that, just about really trying to say that this needs to be part of the decision making process, and then showing children and young people the impact that their voices have had. That's my 2 pence worth.
Thank you, Vanya. And I think that's so key, isn't it, in terms of some of that a simple language change. And that's free to do, you know, it's not going to cost anything, but just thinking about how we frame this area. So as you say, it's not just about their voice, it's actually about their rights. And we've got a UN convention that says that this needs to happen. So I think that's something, you know, one takeaway that I challenge us all to do today is to go away and start to use that terminology. Yes, we're not going to change things overnight, but really asking, you know, are their rights being met and being listened to? Thank you.
Can I just add something to that, Adele? I just remembered back when Laura was doing her introduction earlier, and I think Laura's last slide was something about the Al Ainsley Green, that she said that, you know, he'd said that we need to celebrate children's contributions to society. And actually, I think the sort of question was, if we don't do it, who will? And I think actually, if anyone was to take something away from today, actually, you know, can you be that person who does this?
We know that the national and local press aren't going to do that for us, because quite often, you know, they pick up on all of the negatives. And I know through working with children and young people every day, for every one negative you see in the press, there's 100 positive young people out there who don't always get that spotlight, because that's not how newspapers sell. So yeah, absolutely advocating and celebrating all of the fantastic work that does go on. Hara, I'll come to you. Anything you want to add on that point?
Honestly, I think Bronnie has answered that really nicely, and I was just going to emphasize that final point about advocacy. I think it's our responsibility just to keep talking about the issue, Lynn, that you've spoken about. If we can have as many conversations as we can, whether it's doing presentations or speaking to whoever it is, we will get enough attention to be able to make a change on that. I feel the same way when it comes to involving young children in research. I feel like it's people don't really sort of think about including young children. They do think it's quite challenging. So I feel like it's my responsibility, every opportunity that I have, to talk about it. So I think that's the only point that I would, I guess, add on from what Bronnie has mentioned, is to advocate for the children as any opportunity that we have to really take it on.
Thank you, that's great. And just from my perspective, as I said, from an education perspective, I think there's something simple that adults can do, and in the busyness of the day and our work, we don't necessarily always do, is to have those interactions. I know as a head, and I'm quite surprised this morning, we haven't been interrupted by a young person looking over my shoulder, because that quite often happens when I'm on a Teams meeting. I think it is around those opportunities we all have, whatever roles we're doing, opportunities to engage, and actually just taking that extra minute or two to engage with children and young people, because I love the perspective that children and young people bring. They bring such a different lens on the world. You know, we've all been children and young people at some stages, but we're not now. We're not living it. We might be very, very close to it, whether that's in schools, in hospitals, in social care, but we're not living it the same as they are day to day. And that real opportunity to just get some perspective on that lived experience, I think, is so key. I think the other thing, and I can probably say this kind of unofficially is being in education. I think education's got a huge role to play. I think we've all got a huge role to play, but I do think education's got a huge role to play. We just had, some of you may have seen, we had the new national curriculum report published last week. So I think looking at what we do in the curriculum, citizenship is going to be from 2028 statutory in terms of primary age. We very much have an education system that focuses obviously quite rightly on outcomes, but are we getting that balance right in education of, you know, really teaching our children and young people about their rights? And we know lots of schools do that through the support of fantastic organisations like Investing in Children, through RISE, through Rights Respecting Skills Work. But for me personally, I think there's not enough focus on that through our education system currently as we stand, and some of those changes are welcome. Equally, I can sit on the other side of the table and say, you know, the demands on school and the asks of schools, whether that's teachers, teaching assistants, school leaders, has significant and risen. But I do think, and Rachel touched on this, actually in terms of some really kind of small scale things like the use of language, things like just building that into school cultures can make such a ripple impact both within the school community and then in that wider school community and in the wider school, in the wider kind of community. And that has to and does prepare our children, young people for adulthood. We're talking about kind of the output of some of the crises we're dealing with at the moment in terms of children's mental health. And I always just think about, actually, would some of these children and young people be kind of needing the level of support that they need later on, had they been heard and listened to in the first place? And I do feel quite passionate that I think there's something about all of us just opening our ears a little bit wider and kind of listening and hearing, and as Chris said, taking that action. Because if we make false promises to young people, which often we get that feedback that sometimes government, wherever we're kind of taking that to, doesn't always. And children and young people are great at, and I think Chris touched on this, if they understand there's a reason why this can't happen, or it can't happen now, or they're really keen to know that, and they absolutely can sit with that and go, okay, you know, as adults we might be disappointed that something might not happen, but as long as they know the reason. And I think that really equips them well for when they do go on into adulthood to be asking those questions, and kind of being that curious about, well, what's happening in the world around me. So that's kind of my personal thought from an education point of view. I'm conscious we're nearly at time. So just really, if we haven't got any other questions, just huge thank you to Bronya and our to other colleagues who've inputted, and thank you for all of the really rich discussion this morning. We've got a chat full of some fantastic links, which is brilliant. So hopefully people can go away and dip into some of those links. As always with these network huddle sessions, we've got colleagues from different areas of the sector, all bringing their different levels of expertise. So it's great to see we've got some links. Obviously, we've had the session recorded. So this session, please do onward share when it comes out. So big, massive thank you. If people aren't signed up, and Laura may say this as well, if people aren't signed up to our Child Health Tuesday bulletin, there are some fantastic resources, opportunities that come through the bulletin each week. We have huddles on a regular basis. So we've got one coming up in a couple of weeks' time. So please do link into the network. I will now pass over to Laura just to wrap up today's session. Thanks, Laura.
Hi, thanks everybody. That was a great session. Just to plug from a network perspective, we are heading into winter, so any support to promote our Healthier Together website and mobile app to families this winter would be greatly appreciated. It's our NHS trusted resource for the region and very much supports families to understand what to do. And I know we're already just starting to see from a clinical perspective a rise in flus. So it'd be great if you could get this information shared and disseminated. Our ask very much about If you haven't already yourself, if you've got children, download the app to your phones and create a profile and share with the families that you work with. And we will be sharing some opportunities for voluntary sector organisations and schools at the end of this week to become Healthier Together champion organisations. That will go out obviously to network members through our Child Health Tuesday, but we will be sharing through our network of networks as well. So great opportunity for organisations to get involved. Next slide. Very much communicating and engaging with the network. If you don't already, as Adele mentioned, please sign up. You will get our weekly Child Health Tuesday bulletin going out to our over 2,200 network members, and we do a quarterly news letter. Please do follow us on Blue Sky. We're growing that account as we've moved from as many users have from X. System engagement group, if it's something you think you might be like to be involved in from an engagement perspective, that meets bi-monthly, and it's very much about that supported reach and comms and discussions across the network. As Adele mentioned, there is other network huddles coming up and lots of information. We have got lots of professionals resources on our section on Healthier Together as well, which the links are provided there. And please do follow our Healthier Together Facebook page and share any of our communications as they're going out. So please do stay in touch, as mentioned, and hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you.
Thank you.